In this video, we will be reviewing Sheffrin's and Statman's paper on disposition to sell winners too early and ride losers for too long. We'll be summarizing the theory, analysis, and evidence, as well as giving our review on Gupta's report regarding the paper. In the paper, the author examines the behavioral pattern within a theoretical framework, which includes elements such as prospect theory, mental accounting, regret aversion, self-control, and tax considerations. It then moves on to the empirical studies on panel data of individual investor stocks trades from 1964 to 1970 and the realization of gains and losses in mutual funds. Chantel will be exploring prospects theory, in which there are two stages, the editing stage and evaluating stage. And then there is mental accounting, where investors tend to segregate different gambles into separate accounts and ignore possible relationships between them. David will be exploring the remaining theories on seeking pride, avoiding regret, and self-control. So this showcases a conflict between a rational part and a more primitive part of our body. Prince and Juan will be exploring the empirical section, where Schiffer and Statman perform two empirical analyses. One is on the panel data and the individual investor stock trades, and the other is the realization of gains and losses in mutual funds.
The first two behavioral elements Sheffrin and Statement used in the paper to study the disposition effect are prospect theory and mental accounting. Prospect theory by Kahneman and Tversky in 1979 concerns decision-making under uncertainty. To see how the disposition to sell winners and ride losers emerged in the prospect theory, there are two stages according to Sheffrin and Statement. The first stage is the editing stage, where investors frame choices relative to a fixed reference point. The second stage is the evaluation stage, where investors employ the S-shaped valuation function, which is concave in the gains region and convex in the loss region, implying risk aversion for gains and risk seeking for losses. Mental accounting states that decision makers tend to segregate different gambles into separate accounts and ignore possible interactions between them. Using the example of a tax swap that involves selling stock A at a loss and using the proceeds to get stock B, which has an identical return distribution as stock A. From a behavioral perspective, investors may frame it as closing the mental account of stock A at a loss and opening the mental account of stock B. This is in contrast with the normative frame that recognizes there is no substantial difference between the return distributions of the two stocks. The disposition effect can be seen in mental accounting, in that investors may have difficulty in closing mental accounts at a loss. This is supported by Gross in 1982 that states investors want to get even before they get out. And the reason for them being reluctant to accept and realize losses is because it will then prove that their first judgment was wrong. Gross also suggests to overcome this, one should transfer their assets, meaning investors do not close their original mental account of stock A, so from the previous example, but roll it over together with the mental account of stock B as one mental account. Our partners team have shown an excellent understanding in both elements and are able to show the disposition effect in both elements. Nevertheless, they could also include concrete examples such as tax swaps to explain the concept of mental accounting a bit clearer.
So for section 3, I think overall they laid out this section very well in terms of outlining the psychological aspects of pride, regret, and self-control in the context of trading. So they also brought in a lot of references from other studies done that were relevant and summarized quite well. I like how they basically started the first section as a summary of a previous study done by Thaler and Sheffrin, which Sheffrin and Statman in this paper had adapted to include the disposition effect. So this had to do with the planner-doer model, which is basically you had conflicting interests of the planner side, which was more the logical and rational part, and then you had the doer side, which is the more impulsive and emotional part. And they basically stated that with this in mind, that investors tend to ride losers because they want to postpone that regret and the embarrassment of actually losing, and they want to sell winners too quickly because of the self-pride of believing that they've chosen the right stocks. In the next part, they've basically summed up the fact that many investors tended to sell losers in December, and this was to take advantage of taxes when there's transaction costs present. So basically, they want to take a loss this year instead of postponing the loss till the next year. So they summed up this very well, and then they back this up with theory, with some empirical evidence that had been done beforehand to support this as well. So I think overall this section was written very well. It was clear and it was concise.
So we're now going to consider the empirical evidence that is there. So the paper analyzes two key studies. The first one being Schlabbaum et al. Schlabbaum et al. Provide panel information about individual trades by selected investors between 1964 and 1970. So their article describes the data set in detail and uses this set to analyze realized returns on common stock investments. So before we get into the analysis, I would like to explain what a round-trip duration is. So round-trip duration denotes the length of time that an investor holds a stock before selling it. Now, in the study, they divide these round-trip durations into three categories: 0 to 1 month, 2 to 6 months, and 6 to 12 months. Now, what they find is that the ratio of the number of transactions where a gain is realized to all realizations is consistent across these durations, which shouldn't be the case across theory. Schlabbaum et al. Find that the 40% of all transactions usually end up in a loss, regardless of the duration. However, according to theory, under the assumption that the trades are primarily motivated by the tax option, this ratio should be low for 0 to 1 month, very low for 2 to 6 months, and high for 6 to 12 months. So the theory does not match the empirical evidence, which then brings into question whether investors actually are motivated by the tax option, or does the disposition effect in fact hold a lot more significance than it is currently realized.
I'm only focusing on the second empirical data section of the summary. In this section, Sheffield and Statman further provide us with more evidence in order to prove why their theory is correct, with results being similar to the ones in the section before, therefore having the same conclusion. Having read both the paper and the summary, I can say that this section is very well summarized because it contains all the relevant and important information about the data set, including how they gathered the data, explaining how to analyze it, and the ultimate result. Lastly, after reading the paper, what I understood from this section is that the data was trying to show an analysis based on the realization of gains and losses on mutual funds, and it does so by forming a ratio between redemptions of a fund in month T to the budgets in the preceding month, and with the results being similar to the other empirical data in the paper, it gives the same conclusions. Therefore, since all of this is mentioned in the summary, I get the conclusion that they've also understood the same thing as me. Therefore, I would say that they've summarized this section of the paper very well.
In conclusion, the paper puts the behavior of loss realization aversion as one of the most significant features into a wider theoretical framework, which is where investors sell winners too early and write losers for too long. The report written by Group 2 has summarized and evaluated Sheffield and Statman's paper by explaining the underlying theories behind the disposition effect, outlining the empirical evidence as well as brief analysis of the data, which is both comprehensive and in line with the paper. This is the end of our findings. Thank you very much.